Well, the Supreme Court had a big day yesterday, and not just with respect to former President Donald Trump. The bench ordered lower courts to further review a pair of 2021 laws from Florida and Texas that blocked social media sites from banning political candidates. The laws claimed that conservative voices have been unfairly censored by tech companies. The court's opinion said that actually both lower courts messed it up, and that their analysis of the First Amendment challenges to the law were wrong. The court signaled in their opinion that the First Amendment does not allow legislatures to control what content is published by media companies. Part of the majority opinion read, the Fifth Circuit was wrong in concluding that Texas restrictions on the platform selection, ordering, and labeling of third-party posts do not interfere with expression, and the court was wrong to treat as valid Texas's interest in changing the content of the platform's feeds.
The Florida and Texas laws came after Twitter, now known as X, and Facebook banned former President Donald Trump from their platforms after the January 6th Capitol attack. Yesterday's ruling received strong reactions from free speech organizations. One of those organizations, FIRE, reacted to the news, writing on X, "Should the government have the power to dictate the opinions you see on social media? If you said hell no, then we've got good news. The Supreme Court agrees." That's a big win for free speech and a free internet. Today's opinion makes clear there's no social media exception to the First Amendment. The government can't dictate what post must be seen on X or Facebook any more than it can dictate what op-eds run in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Chris Marchese, director of NetChoice, said in the last 15 hours, NetChoice secured 4 victories in 4 different lawsuits against 4 different states. The decisions prevent the government from controlling the internet's marketplace of ideas or access to it. To give government that power, warns the Supreme Court, is to enable it to control the expression of ideas. Thankfully, that is what the First Amendment protects all of us from. And a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, Jennifer Huddleston, wrote on X, while the holding of the court's decision today focuses on procedural matters, the majority opinion particularly indicates a strong understanding of the impact that these laws could have on the First Amendment rights of platforms to engage in content moderation. So this is a decision that I've been paying close attention to. I read a lot in my other job for Reason Magazine about social media and censorship policies. So what essentially happened is that the states of Texas and Florida said that the platforms cannot take action to take down political speech, political ads, etc., because they thought that there was bias against conservatives. I certainly think there have been ample examples of bias against dissident and contrarian speech on social media. Now we've learned that a lot of that was actually done at the behest of federal officials, but we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, the government of those states said they can't do that. And the Supreme Court is saying, well, actually they can do, if you, the government, telling them they can't take down speech, the censorship is not when the site takes down speech. The censorship is when the government tells the site to take down the speech. The private companies, they can have policies you don't like, and they can take down speech or not take down speech. We can complain about it. But the censorship occurs, the remedy is not the government to tell them what they can and cannot have on their platforms. Now, in practice, this decision is just saying that the lower courts didn't look at that, didn't consider that, that aspect of this properly, so they're going to have to relook at that, although the majority decision does, I think, strongly suggest that the Supreme Court would ultimately conclude the First Amendment stops the state legislatures from saying to a private company, here's what your speech policies ought to be.
And I think that's fairly unsurprising. I mean, this court, for all of its vacillation on issues, has always stood fairly straightforward on First Amendment issues, especially when the government is trying to coerce a company to do or not do something. I mean, we saw with Masterpiece Cake Shop very similar results. What interests me here is the way that this court has scolded the Fifth Circuit now several times. That's the district court that covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And this is a court that can seemingly do nothing right in the Supreme Court's eyes. Clarence Thomas, as you would agree, a very conservative man himself, has twice this term written arguments vacating Fifth Circuit opinions. Brett Kavanaugh was very clear in saying the Fifth Circuit misunderstood and misapplied First Amendment law here in a very straightforward way. And this is a court that is MAGA central. I think 6 of the 17 justices there were appointed by Donald Trump. And they're making mistakes that even this very right-wing conservative court cannot abide. I mean, they've pushed it so far to the right that even Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas have to say, let's dial it back a little bit and maybe reconsider this with a little more respect to the First Amendment.
Yeah, there is a lot of, I think, unanimity of thought on First Amendment specific issues. The First Amendment is among the most litigated at this point, or judicially overseen aspects of our founding principles of our Constitution. The Supreme Court in the last 100 years has moved in a direction of more protection for free speech. If you think about the actual amendment, it just says Congress ought to make no law about free speech, First Amendment. That's now been read to include all other aspects of the both federal and state governments and officials, and the protections are very robust. 100 years ago, the Supreme Court said, oh, actually, it's fine for the government to stop people from distributing leaflets arguing against entry into World War I. That was how bad the protections for free speech were at that time. Since then, in the last 100 years, it has become remarkably tilted the other way. And in fact, things like Masterpiece Cake Shop, areas where I would argue that the underlying behavior was expressive and ought not to be prohibited by the government, but where there's at least some academic or philosophical disagreement about does that actually count as speech. The Supreme Court has said a wider swath of human activity counts as speech and is thus protected under the First Amendment, which is very encouraging to me. Now, of course, they didn't. So this is the second kind of major social media case that came out from the Supreme Court this term. The other one was the Missouri v. Biden, or Murphy v. Missouri. It had like two different names at a different point, on whether the pressure coming from federal officials, particularly over COVID, to censor speech when White House officials and the CDC and everybody else, even Joe Biden himself, said Facebook was killing people, when they yelled at social media companies, jawboning, to try to get them to take down speech, did that violate the First Amendment? And a lot of people like myself saw the reasons for why I think it did violate the First Amendment, but the Supreme Court said no. They said it was not. They said, again, for procedural reasons, that the people had not actually shown harm, and that the harm was likely to repeat, and that there was some redress the court could offer them, so it ends up getting a bit technical. But they declined there to say that pressure from the Fed, because that wasn't a law. In the case of Texas and Florida, they actually passed a law that the Supreme Court said violates the indirectly suggesting that high likelihood of violating the First Amendment, whereas the conduct from the officials was not a law. It was them just emailing and calling and say, hey, we'd like you to do this, not saying you're legally required. And the Supreme Court has drawn a distinction there.
And the Supreme Court has made a few of those kinds of decisions already this term, that there has not yet been a harm to bring merits to a case, which isn't to say that may not be something that could in the future, if legislated, become a justiciable issue. The reality is we have so many of these fights about the First Amendment now because our country has become very tribalized and very unwilling to accept that people can say things we don't like. Social media in many ways is the kid nobody likes. Democrats have problems with it because Elon Musk owns it now. Republicans, and in Florida, Ron DeSantis has gone to war with companies that say things he disagrees with. And this is a reminder of why the Founding Fathers took so seriously and wrote so clearly express protections for speech. Because as is often driven into the ground, it doesn't protect speech you agree with, it protects speech you disagree with. And we find that if you can build a big enough tribe, as DeSantis did in Florida, you can try and curtail speech. What's surprising to me is that they overstepped so far that even this conservative court had to say that your argument on its face doesn't make any sense.
I often think the public anger at social media platforms coming from, you're right, coming from conservatives, coming from liberals, is ill-founded, and then the solutions being offered are ridiculously counterproductive. On the Republican and conservative side, I think you're hearing a little less of this now, maybe because Elon Musk owns one of the major platforms. But remember, the calls to break up big tech. Big tech is silencing conservatives. Well, then we did learn that a lot of that silencing was not motivated solely by the companies, but was under pressure from the federal government and by mainstream media and a bunch of other people. But I've always said, when I talk to Republicans and conservatives, I'm like, social media has been broadly a good thing for the conservative movement. There are all of these conservative news organizations, media organizations that have flourished on social media, and not just conservatives, independent, contrarian. I count my own program Rising as one of those.
Absolutely.
YouTube is our distribution model. It would be insane. It would be like suicide, like shooting myself in the foot to advocate these platforms going away to be replaced by what? By the traditional or mainstream apparatus that was way more hostile to, I would argue, to conservative views. So I really think Republicans were in danger of shooting themselves on the foot when they were stressing, destroying or breaking up or harming the major platforms. And then on the Democratic and liberal side, I mean, I hear so much hand-wringing these days about misinformation, the spread of misinformation on social media. It's like, okay, but then you start looking at the studies that show it's really a small number of people on social media who are perpetually spreading and fooled by outright false information. Is the media literacy all that much worse on social media than it was in other organizations? No. A lot of the claims about interference and from foreign interference and bots and everything always end up being sensational claims are made, and then later you look at it and go, actually, this was a very tiny number of accounts that were not targeted in the right way. It seems like there's been a lot of hysteria on this subject.
Well, there's also a lot of nostalgizing for the time before. I mean, Democrats had no problem with social media when in 2008 Barack Obama utilized it to make a revolution in how we communicated.
They were proud of it. They bragged about it.
And it was worth being proud of. I mean, Democrats had a massive advantage on social media for almost a decade and a half before Republicans figured out how to use the Twitters. And the fact is, we know from the data, and it upsets people to say this, but the studies repeatedly show the misinformation doesn't change people's opinions. It reinforces pre-existing opinions. And you can argue that that itself is unhealthy, but that's also not a new or unmanageable problem. There was a long period of 50, 60 years in this country where political parties outright owned newspapers and published nothing but misinformation and ads. But we found a way to resolve this, and it is the case that I think regulation and government needs to catch up with where we are in tech. We need more people in government who understand the tech, but this is not something to punish tech for. This is a sign that our government and our people need to have a conversation and actually engage with it.
The most reliable voters are watching cable news all day. They're listening to the radio all day, and I would argue that they're getting a lot of bad information in that format too. But nobody's having a heart attack about that. It's just all blame Facebook, blame Twitter. There's something self-serving about it, especially when it comes from people in traditional media or in TV media or in newspapers. I think it's industry competition a little bit. More Rising right after this.